To continue, I'm going to talk about non-associative learning and then classical and operant conditioning just very, very briefly. That's the entire topic of Quiz 3, so we'll be able to cover a lot of that then. I will continue with transfer appropriate processing and then the quiz question about strategies for learning. Metacognition I'm going to separate and put that in a third short lecture. And so notice we're still in the section that's essentially the introduction, and we're talking about just different types of learning. So we've got non-associative learning, which might make you wonder, is there an associative learning? Okay, and the answer is yes. It's just not labeled as such. So the way to think about it is we've got non-associative learning, and that's going to be habituation and sensitization. And then we've got associative learning, and that's classical and operant conditioning. So again, these are, I don't know what happened there. These are the topics of Quiz 3. So for now, let's just realize that this is the type of learning where we are learning to associate things, whether we're associating two things out in the environment. That's classical conditioning. And my S keeps disappearing, or associating our behavior with its consequences, and that will be operant conditioning. But sit tight, we'll cover this in class in a fair amount of detail, so I think you'll feel pretty comfortable with it at that point. For now, let's focus on the non-associative learning. I'm trying to erase this, but it won't work for me. All right. So non-associative learning. Here, there's no association, right? Non-associative learning. All that's happening is you're being presented with a single stimulus over and over and over again. And what happens is over time, your perception of it, so it's a little bit like perceptual learning, your perception of it will either increase or might either increase or decrease. And that's the distinction between habituation and sensitization. Okay. Habituation first. That is when your perception of it decreases over time. The idea is that you kind of get used to it, right? So for example, you are, I think the quiz question was about this with a ceiling fan. So your friend comes over, they're watching TV show with you, and they can't even hear the TV because your ceiling fan is so loud. But you're like, no, what do you mean? I don't even notice this. I've gotten used to it. That's what habituation is. Habituation actually can be very, very dramatic. I once had a professor who was an expert on perception, and he used to testify as an expert witness in trials. And he once testified on behalf of a person who had gotten hit by a train. And he said that because of habituation, this guy didn't even hear the train approaching. Right? So you just get used to it. Sensitization is essentially the opposite, where over time the presentation of some stimulus makes your perception of it get stronger. I like to think of this as like the annoying little brother effect. So imagine in your family you've got a younger sibling who has this terrible habit of scraping his teeth on his fork every time he takes it out of his mouth. And you swear he's doing that on purpose because as the dinner wears on, it's getting louder and louder and louder, right? He might be doing it on purpose, but more likely it's just that sensitization effect that's occurring. Okay, so now let's jump ahead. We're going to go to transfer appropriate processing. All right, so these are in your general principles of learning. Remember, we'll do metacognition a little bit later, but transfer appropriate processing. The idea here is that there is some specificity in the way that we learn and the way that we want to actually recall it later, right? In other words, the way you practice something, the way that you process something should have some relation to the way that you're going to be asked to recall it later. All right, so think of your studying, that's your processing. And then the transfer situation, that's where you're going to be asked to be recalling it later, for example, on an exam. Okay? And I think the best way to think about transfer appropriate processing is to think about when it breaks down. Right? So suppose you study for a test simply by memorizing definitions. Right? That's your processing. And then in the transfer situation, that is when you sit down and take the test, it's an essay test. Wouldn't you panic at that point? Right? You have realized that, I have not processed this in a way that's going to help me to effectively transfer it. Okay? If you're going to do an essay test, you need to study in a way that's going to prepare you for an essay test. Right? And again, that's simply the idea of transfer appropriate processing. Okay, so finally, the quiz question about strategies for learning. And I forgot to get that ready. So let's pull that up quickly. All right, so which set of strategies would probably lead to the best learning and memory? This question is actually on here because I wanted to remind you that material that appears in lecture is covered on exams. Okay, and so if you remember my lecture about a guide to studying is better than a study guide, the 3 strategies that I mentioned are, oops, spaced practice, interleaved practice, and retrieval practice. Spaced, so take whatever time you have available, right? Space it out. Don't take the quiz 5 times on one day. Take it on different days, far apart as you can. Interleaved practice, that is mixing things up. That's taking quiz 1, 2, 3 on one day, and then taking quiz 4, 5, 6 on another day. And then retrieval practice, that's the whole point of taking our practice quizzes. Spaced practice and retrieval practice are in the textbook. It turns out interleaved practice is not, but it is something that I told you about as well.